What's up, everyone? This is Steve Scully, and I'm going to be doing a reaction video to a debate, what is reality made of, between Susan Blackmore, John Ellis, Phillip Ball, and Hilary Lawson. I don't know these people, but it's from the Institute of Art and Ideas, and it's essentially discussing, from a physics standpoint, I assume, and maybe from other standpoints, what reality is made of. So sounded good. It's pretty long, 47 minutes is the reaction video, so in order to keep it a little slower or a little faster, I'm gonna try at least to do this at 1.75 times the speed. If it's too fast, and so be it, I'll change it, but anyway, get this going.
Now, I hope no one will deny, I don't think anyone here will be denying, that materialism is actually pretty successful in giving us theories of the world that work. The trouble is, our theories of physics seem to start talking about things that, in the everyday sense, seem quite nebulous. Fields, or about how space and time might somehow be bootstrapped into existence from the relationships between particles. Meanwhile, we don't really understand quite where we fit into this, how consciousness and experience of qualities comes from quarks and photons. There's no way we can predict what people are going to think about this in 100 years from now, but is there any reason in the here and now to question whether materialism needs to be extended in some way? And is science the only arbiter of that question? Well, I'm delighted to introduce the speakers who are going to help us frame and think about these issues. On my right is Hilary Lawson, who's director of the Institute of Art and Ideas and of the How the Light Gets In festival. First on my left is John Ellis, who is professor of theoretical physics at King's College London and a physicist at CERN. And on my far left is Susan Blackmore, who's a psychologist and visiting professor at the University of Plymouth. Has the materialist view been successful, yet profoundly mistaken? And first off is Hilary.
Let's slow down a little bit.
Thank you. So materialism has a wonderful down-to-earth sort of quality to it, by comparison with the seemingly rather mystical notion of the immaterial and mind and consciousness and mind of God and so forth. But I think that materialism is just as fantastic a story as immaterialism. Science has, from the outset, relied on the immaterial. So Newton, in his initial framing of science, really kicking off contemporary science and providing the framework that is still used, of course, relies on forces. Forces were, at the time when he first suggested this, he was criticized for being mystical and not sufficiently mechanical. He also relied on time and space. There's also mathematics, not obviously very material. And the laws of the universe themselves, what are they? Where are they in this materialist universe? So from the outset, the immaterial has been embedded in science. And there are some materialists who try to get round this puzzle, so they just don't like this, it's not sort of grounded enough. So they try to get round this by expanding the idea of material to include all of these other things, to include time and space and mathematics and so forth.
That's a good point.
The problem with that is that if you extend material to include all of these things, it's no longer obvious what you mean by material at all, and I don't think you have any content to the term. So if the world isn't material, and incidentally there's another problem, which is I think that a purely materialist account of the universe is incoherent because it can't give an account of where the materialist theory is itself. But just as an aside, really. So if the world's not material, what is it? Well, people have had a variety of proposals. It's mind. As I say, some people have suggested it's mathematics. A recent arrival on the block is people are now saying it's information. So people have had all sorts of ideas about what the world is made of, and you can make a good case for all of them. You can develop the narrative. You can make a good case. It can sound plausible, but they all break down because they're human concepts. They're not the nature of the world. And what our concepts are doing and what our language is doing is not describing some ultimate reality. It's enabling us to do things in the world. They're tools to enable us to do things. And if you hold the world as a material thing, then you build the world like that, and you try and make everything material. You operate within that closure, as I would argue. And within that closure, you create your system, and you can do a pretty good job of it. But there are lots of bits of it that just don't work, that you can't quite make any sense of thought, you can't make any sense of other areas of your overall account. If instead you start with immaterialism, you say the world is all mind, well, there are some good people in the history of philosophy who's had a very good attempt to account for how the world could be all mind. So in each case, you can develop the closure. You can hold the world as if it's all material. You can hold the world as if it's all immaterial. You can hold the world as energy. You can hold the world as mathematics. And as I say, some people are having a go at holding the world as information, which I have to say I don't think works very well. But nevertheless, they're plausible narratives. But they will always break down because they are not descriptions of reality. They're the tools we use to describe reality. And that's why it's none of these things. We can't, with language, say what is the ultimate stuff of the universe. What we can do is we can hold the universe in all of these different ways and achieve different things with those different ways of holding it.
Thank you. John, over to you.
Yeah, well, needless to say, I'm the dumb.
That was a good start. I agree, generally speaking. It is important, though, to consider that it's essentially, as he said, all of these things. And so a balance between them at the center point is essentially the essence of what it truly is, which is nothing. I think that's my take. But let's keep going. Let's see what this guy has to say.
Yeah, well, needless to say, I'm the dummy who's a thoroughgoing materialist on this panel. As I said before, my T-shirt, that describes the stuff in the universe. Well, actually, not all the stuff in the universe, but I think in your introduction you mentioned quarks and photons, and so they're in there. Okay, there's some stuff which we don't yet know what it is, stuff that we call dark matter, and I like to joke with that bit up there
because there's more of it.
There's a lot more of it, yeah. And then we also talk about dark energy. I'm not sure whether dark energy qualifies as stuff or not. So, of course, what I've written on my T-shirt is going to be largely incomprehensible to most people in the audience, right? And that's because it's written in a very mathematical language. And so just to sort of make one point of contact with what Hilary just said, mathematics for us materialists is a tool for describing or understanding or manipulating or using our knowledge of this stuff. So it is a tool that we use in our materialist description, although I certainly agree with what Hilary said. It's not actually material in itself. One interesting thing is that our concept of what is material, I think, has evolved significantly in the last century. So Hilary talked, for example, about Newton, who I think had a rather different concept of what is material from what nowadays in the quantum mechanical world we see as material. For example, we now see a connection between particles and fields that was unknown to Newton. But of course, what's written on my T-shirt does not explain everything, right? And it's a very important aspect of our materialist description of the universe, which is the concept of emergence, the phenomena that emerge from the complicated interactions of what is written on my T-shirt. Okay, so this picture, I would claim, is very successful.
This is this standard in physics. Is actually this like statement that the explanation of the universe should be able to fit on a T-shirt, and so people try to do it and actually create T-shirts and be like, see it fits on the T-shirt. And that's where these types of T-shirts come from. It's this like idea that, oh, it's so cool it fits on a T-shirt. Wow, it must be fundamental in nature. But it's an approximation that doesn't actually describe the nature of reality at all, but it describes some small portion in an approximate way where it's able to actually match the observations of that range to a degree where it appears as if it's actually describing the nature of reality, when really it's just simply not.
I would claim it is not mistaken because it works. It enables us to make no mobile phones and no electric cars and so on and so forth. It's not mistaken, but I agree that it's limited. Okay, and I'm not sure whether it provides us with.
The universe is infinite, so this is again limited. The theory itself is limited to a small range of all observations, and then they actually develop a theory on it by using this small range, and then somehow expect this limited interpretation to actually explain everything. And that's not a balanced approach. A balanced approach is to take in a much larger spectrum, optimally basically an infinite spectrum. Then it's balanced because it's across everything, which is infinity. Whereas when we take in this tiny portion of infinity, it's essentially across nothing relative to infinite. And so if you imagine, it's much harder to balance, say, this pencil on a surface that is a point than on a surface that is much larger, because it's taking more things into account, and so the surface itself is much easier to be balanced upon. Whereas in quantum mechanics and basically all the standard models, what's happening is we're focusing on a very small portion and then attempting to get a balanced description of the nature of reality on it, and it's just not balanced. It's off balance, and so it doesn't work.
With understanding, it provides us with description, and as I commented in the previous debate, it addresses questions like what, where, when, and how, but not why. And I think this is one of the key shortcomings that Hilary is concerned about.
Thank you. To you, Susan.
Well, materialism, from the point of view of someone interested in, obsessed with consciousness, materialism has its obvious problem. It gives rise to the so-called hard problem of consciousness. How does subjective experience arise from objective activities in a brain? I think it's a misposed question, because ultimately we have to get rid of this duality. Materialism can't account for subjective experience, and idealism can't account for the material world at all easily. Can experience in any way, practicing different experiences to look into the nature of the universe, help at all? Well, here's my adventures at the moment. I would say I'm a bit obsessed. I'm glad to be invited on this panel because I'm a bit obsessed in an ignorant, exploring kind of way about the stuff of the universe. So one thing I tend to do, this time of year, it would be in my greenhouse late at night. I've been working hard all day, like the song goes, I sure get stoned at night, and I'll have a spliff and sit there and start thinking. Now,
Have a spliff and
okay,
start
do that
sitting
meditation
there
thing I'm used
thinking.
to. Drop duality. Intellectual, experiential. Self
I like this
disappeared into
lady.
stuff, there's just stuff happening. Now, that's fine. As I said, it's an experience, but I don't know how to make that work as a kind of a theory. And what I then can start to think about, one direction to go is, well, where does the material fit in this? If you think about a scientist, or me, you know, doing experiments and so on, all you've ever got is somebody's experience, even if that's looking into a hadron collider or looking at the readouts of instruments. So that pushed me over to the idealism side, but then I think, well, how can we agree? And you've both touched on this in a way, because we agree certainly about mathematics. On another planet, you know, other aliens wouldn't call them electrons and protons, but they presumably discover something similar. So I'm forced into a kind of absolutely no idea what this stuff is, but we are agreeing about it somehow. And this is a very deep I don't know. Here's another one. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Ignorance, it's very nice to be applauded for ignorance. Here's another one. This is another one founded in meditation, and I've only recently begun to explore this. There's a classic Zen koan that says, look behind your own face. And until recently, I thought that was just some kind of metaphor, because a lot of koans actually take you off in all kinds of weird directions. But I found myself on a recent retreat literally doing that. And it was a very, very weird experience, because it felt as though I was looking from the outside in, as well as looking from the inside out. And it had different kinds of weirdness depending where I was, whether I was just in silent meditation or walking around in the silent retreat. But interestingly, what I saw has been described, it's supposed to be ineffable, you can't really say much about it. The best description I've ever read was a man who was poisoned by morphine in Thailand, and he woke up in a horrible hospital with dirt everywhere, and, you know, very happy and content. And he said, it's as though the back of my head has been sawn off, and behind is the dazzling darkness. Now, my experience was of seeing kind of an intense nothingness, a nothingness that somehow seemed to be alive. And I guess this may be something like what people are talking about the ground of being, or something like that. I don't know. But experientially, it's really, really interesting to explore these things. But this gave the impression that it is out of this alive nothingness that comes behavior and talking and all the kinds of things, and the duality of the illusion of self and all the other dualisms that come about. But what is it? I mean, you know, it's to say something completely unhelpful, really. There's a kind of something, nothing, out of which everything comes, doesn't really get you anywhere. But I throw out these experiences in case they're at all relevant, and really my only pitch is, I'm really struggling with this one.
Thank you. Well, first of all, as good philosophers should, we should probably define our terms and clarify what we mean when we talk about materialism, because as Hilary said, it does seem to have broadened. In Newton's time, the idea was that it was all kind of little particles of stuff, and it was all somehow coming out from this. And of course now, and since the 19th century, that notion has broadened into ideas of fields, and in some ways, physical theories can seemingly all be constructed in terms of fields. So I wonder, what we're going to talk about now is, what is reality made of? What is this material? And John, I wonder if you can start by explaining, you know, from the physicist point of view, how we think about materiality now.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier on, we moved on from Newton, so we no longer think only in terms of just little bits doing their thing. And so Hilary has already mentioned how the idea of force and so on was introduced by Newton. And those forces nowadays we describe in terms of what we call fields. I think people have some sort of vague idea maybe of what an electromagnetic field is. They don't want to be too close to a microwave antenna maybe, or a gravitational field. The Earth goes around the sun because it feels the gravitational field. But now we go beyond that, and we see that, you know, to use your term, there is actually a sort of duality between particles and fields. And I already mentioned this earlier. One of the revolutions of quantum mechanics is this dual description in terms of fields and particles. So it's certainly true that our formulation of this materialistic description has changed over the last century, and I would presume that the description that we currently have is also provisional. It's going to be, you know, out of date. I'm not quite sure, you know, when it's going to become out of date, but maybe it won't become out of date before I do. But anyway. I just want to maybe pick up on one thing, which is this issue of consciousness and mind. So let me throw another stone into the pond. I talked earlier on about emergent phenomena, and I personally believe, of course I have no proof, that consciousness and mind will eventually turn out to be emergent phenomena from these physical processes described by stuff on my T-shirt.
Can I pick up on that? If you're
Please do, yes.
Lots of people very glibly say, and I'm not accusing you of that, but lots of people very glibly say, oh, it's an emergent phenomenon. You have cautiously said it will turn out. Now, if you think about emergence, I mean, I think about something simple like wetness emerging from the properties of water. I mean, it took a very long time to work out why and to understand the physics and the chemistry to get to understand, I don't know, surface tension or whatever, as emergent. But somehow mind, I mean, this is the whole problem of mind-body dualism. It seems so utterly different from physical things. Can you plot any kind of a way that this, you said eventually it would turn out. Have you got any thoughts about how it would turn out? Because wouldn't that be fantastic if we could see how this mind-body dualism could be overcome by showing how it could emerge?
Well, you've probably got the wrong person to try to provide you with an answer to that. No, this is not something which I work on that I thought about at all deeply. I think actually we're now at a very interesting stage when this is actually coming to the scientific fore, so to speak. So people are thinking a lot now about artificial intelligence, about deep learning, and I think that now out of that will emerge all sorts of new intuition about how at least parts of the brain function actually come about. Now, whether this will really get as far as what you're interested in, I don't know. But I think it is at least potentially an inroad into how emergent phenomena occur inside our skulls.
It's the emergence that I can't get. I mean, what seems to me that the more we learn about how the brain works, the more problematic consciousness is. So we can now look in brains and see, oh, this person is difficult and it requires a lot of stuff, but and a lot of maths as well. But we can say, oh, that person's thinking about a pink elephant. Oh, and now he's thinking about a frog. And now he's thinking about last weekend, wherever he was. And you can actually see this in individuals with a lot of prior work. So, and we also know, decision-making going on here. As I was talking about the TPJ, where the self-schema is constructed in the right temporoparietal junction, we're learning more and more and more. So in terms of what the brain's doing and the structures and how it gives rise to saying, I am thinking about the problem of emergence, we can get there. But the look of your lovely hair as I sit here and it's shining in the light.
I'm yours, actually.
Oh, mutual adoration, that's great. That's what we want on a panel. That experience, how that would emerge, what that would mean from it to emerge, will become even more problematic to me the more we understand what the brain's doing.
But there are... yes, please, you go.
So I think all we are seeing here, I say all, I don't mean that critically, but what we're seeing here is the playing out of alternative closures. If you adopt a materialist closure, you obviously are focused on producing an account which in the end accounts for everything in terms of material. So John is obviously in the mode of saying, in the future, we'll sort out the problems. The materialist account may not account for everything at the moment, but we'll work out how it's going to do it.
I'm not even sure it will eventually explain everything either. Okay,
okay, fair enough. So, but similarly, accounts that have been given in terms of the mind have tried to account for everything, but they're unable to do so. We shouldn't, therefore, as a result of this think, and this is, in a way, I think, trying to help your puzzle. It's so complex. No, it's not that it's complex because it all seems to go wrong. It's complex because you, I think, are imagining that we might get to one answer which would describe reality. We can't do that. The frameworks of our thought, our conversations that we're having, the theories that we have, are ways of intervening in the world. They are not descriptions of the world. They're ways of holding it. And actually, Heisenberg, obviously, as the founder of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, came across this fundamental problem of particles and fields. And he took the radical philosophical view.
I do want to pause here just for a second because it's interesting. He's saying that these are all ways of holding it. So there's essentially no way to see the world where it comes together. There's just all these different divergent ways. And that's just not true, because if it were to be true, just from a logical standpoint, then what he is saying would be the way of seeing it, in that there is this divergence. So if we were to see this divergence as being a fundamental, insurmountable truth that is just inescapable, then that would be the way to see things. So there, even in that case, there is still some underlying truth that connects everything. And so it's not really divergent because it's connected through some underlying truth. It appears divergent until we bring things back together. So when we start to look at reality, we'll see this thing, we'll see that thing. It doesn't matter what it is, different parts of reality. And so basically reality is one thing. But when we start to separate it into all its parts to try to understand it, then we basically break it apart into all of these little individual components. But then when we come to see how it functions, it's not like, well, now it's all just diverged. The truth is that then it comes back together through one truth. And so there is this convergence and a divergence. So that basically he's focused on the first step and saying, well, everything's diverging based on how we see things. But there is the potential of a reconvergence of everything if we reach that point of understanding.
Of abandoning reality. He said, we don't require reality to get natural science to work. And I'm on the Heisenberg side of this argument. I don't think we need to think that there is some ultimate stuff out there which our theories are somehow able to reach through. I mean, after all, they're human concepts. They're just things that happen in our brain. The idea that something that is going on in us could somehow be the very structure of the universe, and somehow in some ideal materialist universe that some bit of my brain happens to have exactly the same structure as the structure of the material universe out there, seems to me implausible. I mean, that's not how it is. And that's just a function of the way that we think. We think what we do is we generate language, theories, I would say closures, and those enable us to do things. So if we have a material story about the world, we can indeed do all sorts of amazing things, as John said, but not everything. And there are other stories, some of which Susan was identifying, where a consciousness story is a much more valuable way of understanding what's going on and enables us to intervene. And if somebody wants to say, well, we should think of the world in a different way altogether, well, let's see what the consequences of that frame is. But let's not imagine that any of these frames are going to somehow reach through and find some ultimate stuff up there. I think we just have to give up on that theological idea that there is something at the end.
Such a loaded statement to say, I think we have to give up. Like, that's not the answer.
Of our theories, which we are uncovering.
So are you advocating giving up closures? Are you advocating being more flexible?
That's what science itself does. That's why we have quantum mechanics, for example. Just give up on expecting logic and reason to actually make sense. It's counterintuitive, but it is. That's just how it is. We essentially giving up on logic and accepting just blanket, this is just how it is, kind of. I mean, it's a desire for closure, and then finding a closure point, like he's talking about, and that point being just getting off the ride and saying, okay, I've arrived at some understanding where I'm comfortable at stopping, and then encouraging others that, yeah, we should all just stop and chill, because essentially we don't want this pressure. If society is pushing us, even though we've stopped, there's this pressure of people trying to reach further, and it's like, well, why don't you guys stop too, because you should be here too. And then I wouldn't feel that pressure. So there's this desire to not feel this pressure. And the same thing happens for people who are reaching. They have to reach through and therefore experience pressure of their own, which can encourage that person to basically say, I'll just stay here. I'll accept this conclusion that I've come to for whatever reason, and come up with my explanations for why I'm doing it, and here we are.
And being able to take this kind of closure today and this closure tomorrow, or that you just stick with one and know its limitations?
I think that what closures do is they hold the world as things. That's what we do.
But how
we
do
hold
we
the
best
world
live
as
our
things.
lives?
There aren't things out there. Whatever is out there, it's not divided into things. Any combination of things, however complicated combination of things. And I think that what our closures do is they enable us to hold the world by holding it as things. And yes, so I think in order to be able to intervene in the world, we need to have things. But we shouldn't imagine that those things that we create with our closures are actually what's out there. That's not going to work.
So, Hilary, how then do you evaluate the relative merits of those different closures? Because a materialist would say, well, actually, our position, clearly we can demonstrate the merit of that because we can make stuff that works. We can predict things that are going to happen. Can you find a similar criterion for alternative ways?
Yes, I think you evaluate them in exactly the way you say. You say, does it work? So the way that you evaluate a model is not to say, is reality really like that? Because you can't peer through to reality. You just say, does it work? Does it work? Does it enable me to account for the observations that I make in the context of this model? Because all observation is context dependent, is theory dependent. So within the context of the frame, within the context of the closure, does it work? And if it doesn't work, we modify it. And indeed, I mean, the whole of science is built on this. The brilliance of Newton is he comes up with this framework. And the critics initially said, but it's circular, Isaac. You tell us that the apple falls off the tree because of gravity, and we can't identify gravity, and it's a sort of mystical idea. And then you say, but most of the apples are still on the tree. And then you tell us, well, that's because there's another force which we also can't see and we also can't identify, which is holding it there. And any counterexample, any counterexample you did, what do? We just make up a new force. And if you think we've stopped doing that, we've done that in big time recently with dark energy. We've found an observation, which is the universe is accelerating away from us faster than we thought was possible. And so we've invented a new force, which is 70% of the entire universe. We have no evidence for this, and we're not going to be able to identify it. And that's how science works. It invents things in order to sustain its model.
And then it puts it through the sieve and asks how well that idea
and they
stands
ask how it works. And I'm all in favour of it. So I'm not in any way saying there's anything wrong with this. That's exactly what should happen. So the power of it is that we invent new closures which enable us to refine our model, refine our narrative in order to be able to get it to work. But let's give up on the theology that our human constructions and our human theories have somehow reached.
I mean, he's keeps saying give up, and like if you just look at the history, the progress that we have made because we've done this is evidence in favor of continuing to do it. Like, there's no reason to stop when we've made all this progress. Whether or not we're in a position where we found the answers doesn't really matter, because we found more answers than we had before, and so therefore it is working in some capacity. So to say give up, that's fascinating. Although he's made it like, that's such a, I wish scientists would understand what he just said about dark energy. It's just literally made up. For closure, as he says, but also to maintain a belief system, because people don't want to think outside of their box of how things are. They've already concluded that space is expanding, so, well, something's going on that's making it accelerate in its expansion, so we'll just make some shit up. That's
through to how it ultimately is. They're not.
John, have you seen any evidence that persuades you that something more is needed beyond the standard model, literally, that we have in science at the moment?
Oh, for sure, yes. Right. So, okay, as a materialist, I still think in terms of bits. I still think in terms of things. Sorry, Hilary, I think things are real, at least in the sense that I use real, maybe not the sense that you use real, but at least in my sense. But this leaves all sorts of open questions. Like, for example, we know that there is matter, stuff in the universe, but we don't know how it originated. As I already commented, we know that there is some phenomenon associated with gravity that we call dark matter, and we don't know what that is. So there are certainly very important open questions. I would like to thank Hilary for accepting that the materialist point of view has certain successes. Right?
It's massively powerful. I really, I'm not in any way criticizing the idea of science or indeed the methodology. I'm just criticizing what I think is the theology, that it is uncovering the essential character of the universe. It is a brilliant way of creating models that enable us to intervene, to achieve things. Absolutely, we should do that. We should focus on empiricism. We should focus on reason. We need to do all of those things. But we don't need to have this idea that we are arriving at the ultimate description. And indeed, all of the evidence suggests that it isn't, because whatever we've thought is the ultimate then turns out not to be.
I certainly don't think we've arrived at the ultimate description, because, as I said, there's all sorts of lacunae, questions that we can formulate that we don't yet know the answers to. But I again kick back. Science has enabled us to discover things that happen in the universe. In fact, enabled us to calculate those things before the information reached us, and the information is in agreement with the predictions. I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the discovery a couple of years ago of gravitational waves. This is an absolutely mind-boggling thing if you think about it. That Einstein realized that Newton's theory was limited in its domain of application. He found a theory which has a broader domain of application. The first piece of evidence was some tiny little peculiarity in the motion of Mercury around the sun. And now we know that there are massive black holes out there in the universe which every once in a while collide and cause space and time to shake. I mean, that's, I think, truly an earth-shaking discovery. And it's real.
So the question we are supposed to ask, and I think we're getting onto it already, is why does our materialist worldview run into problems? Now, I think we should probably ask, does our materialist worldview run into problems? And can you, do you have an example?
Well, yes, I very briefly stated at the beginning, but the whole of the so-called hard problem of consciousness is one of those. And the hard problem, the term was coined by Dave Chalmers back in 1994, and it has driven a whole lot of research, including Francis Crick's early work on neural correlates of consciousness and so on. The great mystery, it seems to be, is how can we relate objective to subjective? It's a classic problem for materialism, because my experience, let's take your pink shirt. Is it pink? Could be purple. It's a very good example, because I bet some people will see that as pink and some as purple. Everybody has a slightly different visual system. Some of you men here will be dichromats, so you won't be able to distinguish red and green in the same way. Some maybe even monochromats. Most of people here are trichromats, but we're all a little bit different. Nobody else can share my experience of what that color looks like. I know this is obvious, but it's a fundamental problem in consciousness studies, amongst many other problems. We can't answer the questions we ask. We can't say, is he conscious? Are you conscious?
I would say he is.
Yeah, right. Now, whether he says he is or not, he's gone all silent now. But anyway, he doesn't want to get himself in trouble. Yeah, exactly. We can't know. When we ask questions like, I'm just done a massive book on consciousness that had a whole section on animal minds. When we ask, does a cow suffer when you put it in, hold it in a horrible big thing? we think so because we have some kind of empathy, but we might be completely wrong. Lots of experiments have shown that surprisingly chickens aren't particularly disturbed by not having any litter on the ground, even though they prefer it. And you can do these experiments, but we can't really answer the question. And then of course we come on to artificial intelligence. Can an artificial intelligence be conscious? How do we even find out? We don't have any way. If we had a theory of how one arises from the other, this emergence thing, we might be able to answer the question, but at the moment we don't. So the whole of consciousness studies did become mired in this question. And then, so that's one big lot of people concerned about the hard problem and trying to solve the hard problem, and then another whole lot of people, including Dan Dennett, Nick Humphrey, myself, and a subgroup called illusionists, of which I would be one, that we're completely deluded about this, and it's because we're trapped into this materialism versus immaterial, or mind versus matter, or body versus mind, whatever. We're deluded because evolution has seen fit to construct us with illusions of self. It helps us get around in the world. It helps us do things efficiently, but it's not true. We believe in a self in here who's looking out through the eyes, who has free will, which clearly, to me, it can't have, and has a stream of consciousness. All that is a kind of delusion that we've invented, and maybe we can get out of it. Hence me doing these personal experiments with non-duality. So that is an example.
Why not, in a way, solve that problem of there being the sort of incompatible frames of the immaterial and material, and just think of them as being different frames?
Yes, I can do that, and I'm thinking about that from what you said. So I can flip from one to the other. I can flip from, let's understand all about the brain and so on, and then I can flip to sitting in meditation and exploring the experience and so on. Those are different frames. But I'm not happy with that. You might be, but I'm not.
No. So maybe we've got to the one bit, which is the religious bit. Why are we not happy with it? So when the Enlightenment came along and somehow got rid of religion, and not for everybody, apologies for those who still attached to it, but in large part did, people felt bereft. They thought, but I don't know where I am anymore. There's no God. There's no, I will be lost. I will be at sea. And I think it's exactly the same with reality and truth, that we are attached to the idea that there is some ultimate stuff, and we replace the Enlightenment God with a method of somehow getting at this ultimate stuff, but we can't get it. It's exactly the same thing. It's a sort of ultimate point that we can't arrive at. But we don't need to be frightened of giving it up. Giving up the idea that there's a single thing out there, instead of thinking the world is open. It has potential. We can close it in all sorts of different ways with our closures and our narratives. And each of those enable us to do different things and achieve different things, makes of the world one of potential, and the idea that there's nothing that we couldn't do if we could just find a way to hold it like that. And of course, it's not saying there's nothing, there's somehow nothing out there. It's just that it doesn't come ready packed in terms of the things, because that's how we think. We think in terms of things, and that's never going to be the same as whatever is there.
But you're kind of implying that I want there to be one kind of thing or one kind of stuff or something like that.
Yeah.
But let me go back to a lot of your argument, what we can do with this, because what you're implying is that if you take a frame, what's useful about it is it enables you to do something, and you take another frame and it enables you to do something else, fine. But I want to be able to jump from one to the other, and that's the difficulty. If I want to know, for example, is it cruel to treat chickens in this particular way or something, I want to know whether they're capable of suffering, and that is jumping from one frame to the other. And how do I do that? I have to invent a broader frame, and that's really all I'm doing. Not saying I can find ultimate reality, but I can't even see a way to make a broader frame that will help me.
You're not going to be able to make it. People have been trying to make broader
Right,
frames
so you're saying
for the last 10,000 years of civilization.
incompatible.
Everyone thinks they're about to get the right answer. Many people have thought, we're just on the verge of getting a theory of everything. We're just on the go. It's not going to happen.
But you are making a claim about the
it's not
ultimate.
going to happen.
Well,
we're not going to get to the point where we can close down our
I
universities.
want to know if John
arrive.
knows. John thinks it's going to happen.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with what Hilary is saying, but equally I have sympathy with what Susan is saying.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah, right. My wife accuses me of being diplomatic. so I think the way that I see things, to choose a topical analogy, is like rain falling on the ground. Right? So no individual raindrops fall. These are patches of understanding or knowledge or description. Right? And then as more rain falls, these things connect up. So the different patches percolate. And eventually, you might, if you're lucky or unlucky, have the entire paving stone covered with water. So let me take an example from the contemporary materialistic description of the universe. So I talked a moment ago about the fantastic success of Einstein's theory of general relativity describing black holes. Amazing. But we talked earlier about quantum mechanics, and as has been said, at the moment we can't sort of construct some bridge between these two, some theory that reconciles these two. And I personally have been for a long time convinced that when we eventually do find that sort of overarching theory which unifies quantum mechanics and general relativity, that one or the other or both of them will turn out to be not quite right. Okay, I think that's more or less inevitable. And but whether that's going to happen anytime soon, I don't
More
know.
or less.
And you were saying that throughout history there have been physicists saying that we've almost got there, right? And that was certainly something that a lot of people were saying, Lord Kelvin and all sorts of other senile old physicists back at the end of the 19th century. But I'm not saying that, and I don't think Hawking was saying that either. I think that there is, and maybe soon we will arrive at, a theory which is more complete, with fewer patches than what we have now. But to get to the ultimate theory, as I commented in an earlier debate, I think that is an aspiration rather than an immediately attainable objective.
So
It's
it sounds as though
infinite.
perhaps you're suggesting that
It is infinite, so it is impossible to truly reach it, but we can get down that path further, and so much further that it essentially appears relative to where we are today as if we have reached it. Jesus.
The frustration maybe that Susan has is maybe you're just a bit impatient to have all this joined up, and you're
Yeah,
not
I'm not
waiting
very
for the
good at
dots
patience,
to
yeah.
join up. Because one could say, well, what you're saying is that there are some things that science still doesn't have the answers to, but why leap ahead and decide that actually it's not going to find those answers? We're going to need immaterialism in some sense to find those answers, rather than just accepting that these are, we don't have a scientific...
Wait, what was that question? Where's the question? What are the benefits of going beyond materialism?
Need immaterialism in some sense to find those answers, rather than just accepting that these are, we don't have a scientific explanation of consciousness yet.
Dan Dennett has described the problem of consciousness as the only remaining mystery, or the last remaining mystery for science. I think that's an exaggeration, but what he meant by mystery was something that we don't yet know how to investigate. So we have problems in science, we have questions, and would you say that the split between quantum mechanics and relativity is like that we don't know where to... Is that a genuine mystery in that sense? We don't yet know what to look for or how to set about it? Because most problems in science, certainly in neuroscience and the things that I know a bit more about, we have a lot of ideas of how to go about it. We get better and better scanners, we get better understanding of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and what have you. We know what kind of questions to ask. With consciousness, we seem to be in the dark. We don't even know what questions to ask.
Well, I think as far as quantum mechanics and general relativity are concerned, I mean, we have some ideas about how we could probe for a theory which would reconcile the two. And maybe it's black hole mergers I talked about a moment ago. Maybe other black hole mergers could provide us with some important clues in that direction, although no promises. But I'm impressed as a complete external observer by the progress that people have made in terms of studying the internal processes of the brain and correlating them with actions. People can now move objects with their thoughts, for example. Telekinesis is finally here, and you can see these maps of how a thought moves around inside the brain. Are these fantastic tools that are going to cast
Absolutely
light on
wonderful.
your problems?
No. Oh, they might, but that's a really good example. Thank you for that. So
fascinating.
you have this, what he means is not real telekinesis, the sort that I investigated years ago and don't think exists. A thing that picks up your thoughts and uses a machine that's using energy to move something. Now, yes, we're learning more and more about that, but is that a conscious thought or an unconscious thought? We're very good at saying, oh, I thought about that consciously, or I did this action consciously, and other things, I wasn't really thinking about, I wasn't really conscious of that, it just, whatever. What on earth do we mean?
That's
this leads to
fascinating.
the people who believe in the hard problem and looking for the neural correlation.
That is fascinating. A machine that picks up your thoughts and then moves something using energy. Dude, that's fascinating. Some part of me is like, well, maybe somewhere down the line we'll be so aware, so conscious that we'll be able to do things on a scale where effectively we don't need the technology we have. But some other part of me says, well, maybe we just reach that point of understanding of how things work where our technology is able to do the things that we think that we should be able to do, like telekinesis, but in a more technological way. And then that's actually how it's done, is through some actual mechanism of some machine or some technology with understanding, which then brings thoughts of, well, then who has it, because ultimately we're all equals. And so if one person has it, this capacity to do that type of thing, then why do they have it? Like there's going to be a financial barrier, which is completely unrelated to the individual's deservingness, I guess, of that having access to, say, telekinesis. And so there's going to be an imbalance that comes from that type of thing. So then that makes me say, well, then maybe it really is something that only people who truly understand how to do it, and I mean understand, will be able to do it. And so then there's not this imbalance that comes because they've actually learned the they've gone through the prerequisite courses, if you will, to be able to have access to that information and utilize it, rather than having just simply paid something and not done anything to put themselves in the position, which is what one of the problems is of us having access to things where we never really did anything in relationship to that. We just did some other thing that gave us money, and our position in life was kind of circumstantial, nothing to necessarily do with our own actions. Like, it's just luck to be in a certain position versus someone else who's not in such a fortunate position, which it just seems Anyway, that's just an interesting thought, though, of this concept of a technology that it actually picks up your thoughts and transmits it to then move something. My guess is that we will, like, if there's real telekinesis beyond what she was just mentioned, that odds are we would first invent the technological means, which would bring more imbalance into the world, because then people who didn't really do anything to actually, like, from a philosophical standpoint, they didn't necessarily, like, they're not philanthropists or anything, they're just literally the ones with the means to have it are the ones that have it, and then they're not necessarily, like, thinking about the greater good of all. But then that would create a greater imbalance. But then over time, I mean, that's how our supernova happens. It reaches a point where it begins to get much more unstable, and then suddenly, boom, all the waste is shot off, and the system itself reaches a new stable, steady state. And that's what's happening in society, is we're going through a supernova cycle as we evolve into the next stable, steady state. And I mean, that's even evidenced in our radioactive environment by having nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. The instability of the system of society is so high that we actually manifest it in ways where we're using nuclear energy. But that's just a stepping stone in our evolution, in essence, from our current steady state to the next steady state, where we actually are stable again. And right now we're going through a period of change where activation energy is being input to actually change us to become what we will become. So it's important that we have this activation energy and instability. Instability is vital if we're changing to a new stable, steady state. The difference is, and the important part is, are we moving upward or downward? Are we falling into collapse, or are we moving to a higher state of equilibrium? Either way, the equilibrium arises from a reaction.
Correlates of consciousness think that there's consciousness sort of attached to some neurons and not others. That was Crick's view, the consciousness neurons. Or that certain processes in the brain are the ones that give rise to consciousness and others don't. Or that some have qualia attached. That was V.S. Ramachandran said that. All these things.
It's a very materialist analysis that she's mentioning. All these, like, the neurons give rise to, rather than vice versa, where consciousness gives rise to the physical. I think it's, as she mentioned, dualistic. So, like, it's kind of like the which came first, the chicken or the egg. Like, both came first, both came second. They're both dependent on the other. Neither can exist on their own, and they both coexist simultaneously and co-create the other simultaneously. I think that's the best way to look at it, rather than one way of just straight biology creates consciousness, and the other way, which is equally as one-sided, where consciousness creates the physical.
It's bonkers to me. It's taking the hard problem. It's accepting dualism and trying to cross the bridge. Or you have to say, give some other account. My own account would be, these are post hoc attributions we make to certain actions that isn't actually a difference between conscious and unconscious. But the fact that you can find an activity in the brain that can cause a movement of that machine out there doesn't help us with this problem of conscious versus unconscious.
Well, actually, sorry, can I just ask you another question about this? So I read about studies that show that actually things happen, actions occur before one is conscious that they're going to happen.
Yes. Yes, Libet's famous experiment, which probably many of you know, he had to do it with really simple action like this, because that's all he could do using EEG in 1985. It's been done many times now with fMRI scanners, and I think maybe other kinds of scans as well. But the question of timing your thought to move is difficult. But as a superficial explanation of this is that what happens is people have to decide when to flip, or in more modern experiments to flip right or left hand. And for the flipping, you can your time when they decide to move, it comes about half a second, which is a long time in brain terms, before the the decision, the movement happens. With this left-right thing, by looking at the scanner, you can tell up to 8 seconds before which choice the person's going to make, and they think they haven't decided yet. Now, does this really tell you that consciousness comes after the fact, or is it only telling you that your attribution, your later decision, looking retrospectively about when you thought you became conscious? We don't know, and there are endless debates around that. I think it is a bit of a nail in the coffin of free will, but then there's plenty of them.
Before we open up to questions, I want to finish with one final question.
She keeps bringing up how free will doesn't exist. And she said that earlier, and I was probably just not actually reacting and just watching. But my immediate response in my head was that it does exist. Absolutely exists. And just like I just said, there's both sides of it. Simultaneously, it absolutely does not exist. Everything is completely deterministic. And yet simultaneously, everything is completely free. There's this dualistic aspect to everything, including free will. So in essence, we have the free will to make the decisions we make, and we do freely make the decisions we make. And yet simultaneously, those decisions are exactly the decisions we were meant to make in that moment, because the overall scheme of things is much more influential than we are, in that everything is moving us. And so essentially we have no free will, because we're just basically cogs in the machine, if you will, from that perspective. And it's true, but it's also true that we have absolute free will. We make the decisions we make, and we can always change our decisions. And if we do, it's exactly what was meant to happen, in that was what the overall movement of everything was towards our free will decision to I don't know what I was saying. Towards free will decision to see free will. I don't know what I was talking about. I lost track of my train of thoughts, but it's important because there's two sides of it. I mean, it's indisputable that free will does not exist, but it's also indisputable that free will does exist. And the reason that it's indisputable in both cases is because there's this dualistic nature of reality.
I want to put to each of you briefly, which is...
Sorry, and then just one more thing. And also what that means is that... what was I just saying? I lost my thoughts again. Okay.
Are there benefits of going beyond materialism, and if so, what do you think they would be? And Hilary, could I start with you?
Well, there's every benefit in getting out of thinking that any single closure is going to answer everything. And I think that one of the things that Susan's very interesting about just describing that the sort of arguments therein is in with higher consciousness. But I think a lot of the time people propose things.
Oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It was what that means is that it's important to not be off center. Center is a balance between both sides, seeing that yes, there is free will, but no, there is not free will. And so by having both of those, we basically have two hinge points to hold on to, so that we at the center are in balance. But if we only look to one side, then kind of like it's just out of balance, like tipping to one side, tipping to the other side. And so if we're out of balance, we're basically saying there is no free will. We're out of balance. It's as simple as that. We're out of balance because there is free will, but there isn't. We are recognizing that one aspect of it. It's true, but there's also the other side of the coin. And so if we don't recognize the other side, we're not at center, because we're only taking into account half of it. Balance comes through a combination of the positive and negative, yielding neutrality in essence.
Susan's very interesting about just describing that the sort of arguments therein is in with higher consciousness. But I think a lot of the time people propose things in order to fit in with the idea that they have to have a single overall account. So panpsychism, for example, is somehow an attempt to overcome this problem of material and immaterial with, seems to me, a rather crazy supposition. But it's an attempt to try and provide some overall account. I would say, look, we don't need to have that overall account. Sometimes the desire to create an overall account is a very valuable thing, because it's a driver of forcing your closure, seeing how it works, explaining the acceleration of the universe by creating something that's 70% of everything. That's fine as a goal, but we don't have to think that we need to do that. We can operate within each frame, within each closure, and we can achieve all sorts of things, many things that aren't accounted for by materialism.
Susan, should we go beyond materialism?
I'm slightly bothered by the term closure. I rather prefer openness, but I suppose you could say that I'm closed in very many respects. But when I think about a lot of my life, how do I feel about this? How, I may have to make some decision. I'm not thinking material. I'm thinking mentally, emotionally, in all these other ways. When I'm thinking about somebody else, worrying about them or wondering about them, then these things don't come up in material terms. They come in other terms. It doesn't seem, and that doesn't mean it's not true, but it doesn't seem that I'm closing on one or closing on the other. They flow into each other. And I think, therefore, it's perfectly natural to be living our lives in two worlds. And if you become too closed on anything, you've got a problem. But I don't see why we need to.
John, is your
I
materialism
like how
shifting at
he's
all?
taking notes.
This afternoon. I sincerely hope that it's shifting all the time. So I certainly see tremendous value in different perspectives. And I'm reminded of Picasso, who really brought this to the fore in the artistic world, where in the same painting you see the same object from various different directions, and that gives you a completely unique impression, so to speak, of the object that, to my mind at least, was not present in the work of previous artists. And so we were talking earlier on about patchwork descriptions of what I would describe as material reality, and I'm all in favour, for example, of general relativity and quantum mechanics as complementary descriptions of part of what's happening in the universe, which at some point they're going to get closer and closer together, and they may well be irreconcilable, and as I said, we're going to have to modify one or the other, and I think that's going to be a very useful syncretic experience for physicists when that happens. If I might just make a comment on one other thing. So Hilary said that science had killed off religion. I'd just like to emphasize, I don't think science is in conflict with religion, and I said earlier on...
Oh, no, not that debate. Of course
No,
it
that's
is.
not what I was intended there.
So I'm not at all religious, but as I commented before, materialists deal, like physicists like myself, deal with the what, where, when, how, but not the why. And I think that Hilary, and also Susan, are sort of looking a little bit for a why.
Yes.
And
Guilty.
And I'm not.
We are out of time, I'm afraid. Please join me in thanking our panelists very much. Thank you all.
That was great. That was a great little debate. Yeah. So I'm gonna stop this since it's already 52 minutes. But great debate. I really liked all the guests. It's informative, and I like their perspectives. It's good all around. Thumbs up. All right. Peace out.